Good afternoon to all. My name is Susan Kent-Avgin, and I'm a member of the Program Committee for the Generations After. Our nonprofit organization is composed of children of Holocaust survivors, as well as a number of survivors and grandchildren of survivors. We are thrilled to be presenting Becoming a Ritchie Boy. Our guests will take us on a journey back in time with a real-life tale of a unique military intelligence program of prowess and cunning. I'm delighted to add that several registrants have ties to the Ritchie Boys, including Mr. Herbert Mirez and Mr. Henry Block, both who were Ritchie Boys themselves, and other close relatives of Ritchie Boys. Another registrant wrote in that he is certain that his father utilized intelligence provided by the Ritchie Boys in the successful Battle of the Bulge. I will be handing the proverbial baton to Dr. Todd DePastino, Director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, who will introduce our guest speakers and moderate the program. If you have not already read the bios of our guests, the link to that is included in the chat. Periodically throughout the program, we will also be providing a link to a very short post-program survey, which we would greatly appreciate your completing. Please post any questions you have in the chat, and Dr. DePastino will address them at the end. We invite you now to sit back and be ready to learn and enjoy.
Thank you all. Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for joining us on this sweltering Sunday for a very cool conversation about the Ritchie Boys. I'm Todd DePastino. I'm a historian and executive director of the nonprofit Veterans Breakfast Club, which gets veterans together with the public to share their stories online and in person. And you can check out more about what we do and check out our schedule at veteransbreakfastclub.org. And our first guest today is Dr. Beverley Eddy, whom I met last year when she joined our program on the Ritchie Boys on the Veterans Breakfast Club. She's the author of the recent book, and I have to say, highly successful book, and as an author, I'm a little bit jealous, of Ritchie Boy Secrets, How a Force of Immigrants and Refugees Helped Win World War II. Beverley is a professor emerita in German at Dickinson College and has published a great deal of scholarship over the years in Scandinavian and German literature, in folklore, and in the social history of words, which I love. Ritchie Boy Secret is Beverley's fifth book and her third to touch on World War II. Beverley, welcome today, and thank you for sharing some of your expertise with us. I want to say what Susan has said and invite people as they listen and watch to put any questions or comments they may have in the chat, and we will address them towards the end of the program. Beverley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Todd, and hello to everyone out there. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted that you will be hearing today from Dan Gross. Dan is the real expert on all things having to do with Camp Ritchie, and he is the one who got me hooked on the Ritchie Boys and who persuaded me to write my book. Could we have my cover slide up, please? There we go. Okay, in my book, I write both about the school at Camp Ritchie, the trained men in all aspects of military intelligence, and about the achievements of the men who took this training when they went out into the field. And I'll follow the same pattern in today's talk. Next slide, please. First, some statistics. Fully 60% of the Ritchie Boys who trained at the camp were American-born, but many of these were born to immigrant parents. Some of them were persecuted minorities in our country, Black Americans, Native Americans, and Japanese Americans, or Nisei. But by far the largest percentage of foreign-born trainees, 19.1%, were German and Austrian refugees from Nazi Germany. And because I will be limiting my talk today on the Ritchie boys who were trained to interact most intimately with the enemy as interrogators of prisoners of war, my focus will, of course, be on those Germans and on those who had grown up speaking German or spending considerable time living abroad. Next slide. The man who actually shaped the Camp Ritchie program was the camp commander, Charles Banfield. He was a World War I veteran, a flying ace, and most importantly, he served as assistant chief of the Military Intelligence Service in Washington at the same time as he was operating as commander at Ritchie. This greatly aided communication between Camp Ritchie and the War Department in Washington. Banfield believed that the men at Ritchie should master all areas of battle. They studied German army organization, terrain intelligence, close combat, the reading and evaluation of documents, map making, the effects of weather patterns, and communication of intelligence by radio, Morse code, and pigeons. They also had a lot of field training. But what interested me in particular was the fact that Banfield believed that the best way to train men for the battlefield was to immerse them in all aspects of the war. As a result, this camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains was turned as much as possible into a staged war zone. Next slide. And so, when students first arrived at Camp Ritchie, they were astounded to enter what appeared to be land occupied by conquering Germans. They might see a German staff car drive up the road with German officers sitting stiffly in the back, or a company of uniformed SS men marching past singing Nazi war songs. These men were German reenactors who had demonstrated every kind of German uniform, piece of weaponry, and kind of military transport. Much of this material had been taken in the North African campaign. Not only were the Ritchie boys surrounded by what looked like German occupied territory, this immersion served to reinforce and expand upon their classroom learning. Next slide. Mock Hitler rallies were held at Camp Ritchie every 6 weeks, so that students could witness the fanatic enthusiasm of the Germans for their leaders. Here we see Hermann Göring as portrayed by a professional wrestler who went by the name of Man Mountain Dean. These rallies were put on by the camp's visual demonstrations section, and it was made up of actors and writers who wrote and performed skits in support of the teaching program. They often took these dramas on the road to other army camps. It is estimated that by the end of the war, these actors had performed in over 300 demonstration skits, and that over 225,000 men had attended these performances. Next slide. Full scenes of battle and conquest were staged by the camp's reenactors. The set for this piece is a local farmhouse with one wall removed so that the audience could watch action both in and outside of a building. Next slide. This farmhouse was also used for class exercises. One of these exercises involved moving from room to room through this booby-trapped house to discover, without tripping them, 18 hidden mines. They also practiced searching for hidden mines in the body of a downed airplane. Next slide. The trainees had numerous outdoor exercises. One, repeated weekly, involved Army azimuth training. The would-be Ritchie boys were trucked out into the countryside at night and dropped off in pairs with nothing but a camp map and campus. Their assignment was to determine their location in the forest on the map, and from that, to find their way to specified coordinates where they would be met by the Ritchie trucks for a ride back to camp. Those who failed to arrive at the site within a given time frame had to return to the camp on their own. Orders stated that they were not to ask directions of any local residents, although I'm sure our two Ritchie boys that are present can say that quite a few of them did ask for directions. But to make things tougher, the men were given maps that listed all the mountains, rivers, etc., in a language the soldiers could not understand, such as Vietnamese. The two-day maneuvers had the added stresses of the men's being attacked by 200 reenactors dressed in German and Italian uniform. In addition to fighting off these attackers, the Ritchie boys were given the assignment of figuring out which division the attackers belonged to, what guns they were firing, and what the casualty count was. The 8-day exercises involved multiple assignments. Lieutenant Howard Bowman said of his exercises, "A covered truck took us up in the Catoctin Mountains. It was cold and it was snowy. They dumped us out of the truck and made us find our way to a certain point on the map. There was a tent there and there was a German prisoner to be interrogated. We interrogated him and then wrote up the interrogation report. We then had to transmit it by Morse code or radio to some place. Then we would go to another point, and there we would find some German army documents, which we had to interpret and analyze, and so on." Next slide. All the Ritchie boys were required to go through these outdoor exercises as part of their 8-week program. Colonel Banfield carefully monitored each man's progress through the first 5 weeks of the program, and they were then assigned to an area of specialization. There were 3. Interrogation of prisoners of war, or IPW, was by far the largest, followed by aerial intelligence and photo interpretation. Here, the men were given aerial photographs, then using stereoscopes, and eventually, by simply refocusing their eyes, the men learned to analyze photographs for enemy movement and for camouflaged vehicles. This information would then be put into a hand-drawn map of the area for use by the unit commander, either in conducting air raids or direct attack. The smallest, most select group specialized in order of battle. Here, the men were trained to evaluate enemy materials, official reports, enemy orders, personal letters, newspaper articles, and so on, for information as to the composition and strength of every German fighting unit in Europe. This information was then written up and distributed to the Pentagon and to the fighting forces in the field. With this material, one could determine the name of each unit commander, the history of the unit in the field, and the state of its weaponry. This was extremely helpful to the Ritchie interrogators in the field, since they could quickly look up information on a prisoner's unit before beginning their questioning of him. Today, I'd like to focus on the interrogation training program at Ritchie. Next slide. The program seems to have been based, at least in part, on lectures delivered by Sanford Griffith for the 3rd Army IPW School in Camp Bullis, Texas. Griffith had worked as an interrogator in World War I, and after the war, he had studied psychology, persuasion, and marketing for the advertising industry. The principles of good marketing melded well with principles of successful interrogation. At Camp Bullis, Griffith had outlined 16 of these as hallmarks for successful interrogations. Colonel Charles Barndorf, an Austrian immigrant, was brought to Camp Ritchie from Camp Bullis as chief of Ritchie's German section. He now reduced Griffith's 16 successful interrogation techniques to 5. The first of these, exhibiting superior knowledge, came, of course, from the interrogator's access to the materials assembled by the Ritchie specialists in order of battle. The idea was simple. One should begin an interrogation by asking the prisoner a question to which one already knew the answer. Then, when the prisoner refused to answer, the interrogator could answer the question himself. This was intended to ease the prisoner's mind regarding military security and convince him that the interrogator already had access to the information he had hoped to keep secret. Components 2 and 3 were designed to develop rapport. The offer of a chair or a cigarette, followed up with a conversation about a subject of mutual interest, would cause the prisoner to relax and make him more likely to let important information slip out. Component 4 had a similar purpose. Let the prisoner relax and see what subjects interested him, then expand upon them. They frequently led into component 5, an indication of the prisoner's greatest anxiety or fear. And this often indicated how the interrogator could best pressure a difficult prisoner into revealing important tactical information. In fact, it became common practice whenever a prisoner refused to answer any questions to express sorrow that in that case, one had no choice other than to deliver him into Russian hands. Next slide. There were quite a number of class sessions devoted to psyching out prisoners, to determining who would be most resistant to question and who would readily respond to a sympathetic ear. Here is a particularly novel visual exercise. The trainees were asked to study a comic strip and on the basis of that comic strip, do a character analysis. The trainees were also given questionnaires about their classmates, and their assignment was to come up with a similar psychological picture. Here, the questions regarded religion, sports, leisure time activities, and family. Next slide. After thoroughly analyzing various subjects, the Ritchie boys were ready to conduct their first interviews. First, though, they watched an interrogation skit put on by the visual demonstration unit. It showed them the basic setup for an interrogation. An armed guard is present. He not only is there for protection, but is available to provide the materials the interrogator might need regarding the prisoner's history. Notice that the interrogator is seated and appears friendly and courteous, while the prisoner stands before him. It was drummed into the Ritchie boys over and over again that they were forbidden to manhandle or even touch their prisoners. Next slide. The first task of the interrogator was to take and examine the prisoner's Soldbuch, or pay book. All German soldiers were required to have this upon their person at all times. This pay book served as an official ID, but it also included the soldier's hospitalization records, medications given to him, his army supplies, and his previous army assignments. The assignments were especially valuable because as the soldier got a new assignment, the old one was simply crossed out, but it was still extremely legible. This is the point at which the armed guard might step briefly out of the room to get order of battle information relevant to that particular soldier. Next slide. In the Camp Ritchie training, there is an elaborate system for creating characters and storylines for the reenactors who would pretend to be prisoners in the interrogation classes. And these change constantly so that characters and storyline would not become known ahead of time to any of the trainees. Not only were specific types developed, various wartime situations were also outlined so that trainees could learn how to psych out a prisoner and how to elicit tactical information, not only from enemy soldiers, but also from French and German civilians. And the reenactors seem to have enjoyed this work. As one wrote to his family, quote, "What a job I have for the next 11 days. I play a civilian 2 times a day and I get interrogated. For this afternoon, I was assigned the role of the owner of a whorehouse who wants to make an arrangement with the American Army. Boy, will we have fun. The camp had a long row of interrogation tents where many of these interrogations took place. Next slide. There, the interrogators found a variety of characters. These might include a fanatic Nazi, or a frightened youngster, or a broken old man. And there were also women who were interrogated, played by Camp Ritchie Wax, and one of them would burst into tears whenever she was addressed harshly by her interrogator, and so on. Next slide. I'd like to turn now to just a couple of the Ritchie boys to show the variety of work and the kind of guts and initiative these men typically used in performing the tasks for which they were trained. Frank Brandstetter was an older soldier who had been born and grown up in Transylvania. He actually wanted to become a parachuter, but was turned down as too old for the training. But Brandstetter managed to persuade the commanding general of the 101st Airborne of the necessity for Ritchie-trained interrogators to be integrated into the infantry airborne divisions. The general agreed, and Brandstetter became the first U.S. Army officer in charge of the first jump-qualified IPW team. He and his team, along with several others, jumped behind enemy lines with the airborne forces on D-Day. By June 9th, he and his men were interrogating prisoners and learning the coordinates for mobile anti-aircraft guns and for German ammunition and fuel dumps. These were passed on through the appropriate Allied radio channels, and as a result of this information, American naval guns successfully destroyed many of them. Next slide. Now, what special techniques did the Ritchie boys develop for getting especially difficult prisoners to talk? Some, while not using torture, used physical discomfort to achieve their ends. One of the Ritchie boys revealed that he would not let his prisoner use the toilet until he agreed to answer questions. Another literally raised the temperature in the room and would not let the prisoner remove his heavy coat. Some made the prisoners supposedly dig their own graves. Then, only after they talked was it revealed that the graves were actually going to be used by the Americans as sanitation trenches. But what about a situation where one had to get tactical information very, very quickly, and one had an especially difficult prisoner to work with? With torture and manhandling out of the picture, how could the Ritchie boys, through simple psychology, get them to talk? I'd like to give two examples. Austrian immigrant Leo Handel served in Italy, and in a particularly critical case, learned that Axis forces were preparing a midnight battery assault on the town in which they were stationed. It was then essential that the Americans learn at once the location of the assault battery so that it could be destroyed. Handel took his prisoner, a German officer, to the schoolhouse located in the center of town, figuring that this might be near the target of the assault. Sure enough, as midnight approached, the officer grew increasingly nervous and finally blurted out that the schoolhouse was actually the main target of the assault. At this point, all the American soldiers cleared out of the schoolhouse except Handel and the prisoner. When the prisoner complained that the Geneva Conventions required the German prisoners of war receive the same treatment as American soldiers, and that he should be allowed to leave with the others, Handel calmly replied, "I am an American soldier." He then confiscated the German officer's watch and stopped the clock on the schoolhouse wall. The suspense became unbearable. The officer finally talked, and the battery was destroyed. Ib Melchior, the Danish son of Wagnerian opera star Lauritz Melchior, was stationed in Germany in counterintelligence. He developed an uncanny ability to spot Nazi spies and traitors. In one case, he learned that an arms cache had been buried somewhere on the grounds of a large German farm, and that not even the farm family knew where it was located. Melchior thought differently and called in the farmer and his 20-year-old son for questioning. Both professed ignorance of the cache's whereabouts. Melchior tried interrogating the two men together and then separately, but neither budged. Finally, Melchior said to his partner, "These men are useless. Let's get rid of them." He had the partner take the father away while he led the son in a different direction until father and son could not see each other. Melchior had already figured out that the son was most likely to give up the information, even though the son remained belligerent and refused to talk, and so he followed a prearranged plan. From his hidden vantage point, Melchior's partner fired his pistol into the air. At the same moment, Melchior pointed his own pistol at the boy's head, and the son collapsed. He was now convinced that his father had been killed and that Melchior was about to kill him as well. He led Melchior directly to the site of the underground cache. Next slide. Most interrogations, of course, were not as dramatic as these. And as the war wound down, the Ritchie boys would be tasked with interviewing hundreds and thousands of German troops and civilians on a daily basis in order to separate criminal Nazis from the floods of refugees that poured into the captured territories. Martin Selling, a German Jew, interviewed thousands of Germans, both during and after the war, and with a simple sentence struck terror into the hearts of many of them. Whenever a prisoner asked him where he learned to speak such good German, he would say, "In Germany," and then add in a threatening tone, "And as a prisoner in Dachau, I learned the art of interrogation." Next slide. One of the most successful interrogation teams served under the command of Albert Rosenberg, another Jewish refugee from Hitler's Germany. Most interrogation teams were a mix of nationalities, but Rosenberg's team was made up solely of immigrants from German-speaking Europe. These men had some familiarity with all the major European languages, but more importantly, they could communicate in all the dialects that were spoken in Germany and Austria. Rosenberg and his team were among the first to enter the Buchenwald concentration camp, and they were charged with making a complete and thorough investigation of Buchenwald and writing it up as an official army report. This study was to include how the camp developed, how it was structured, and how it was run. Time was of the essence, since the liberated prisoners were to be held at the camp until the report was completed. In order to create this report in timely fashion, Rosenberg selected a representative cadre of former prisoners to write the camp's actual history. Meanwhile, he and his team interviewed several thousand of the liberated prisoners. This report was used the following year at the first Nuremberg trial of German war criminals. Next slide. Indeed, Ritchie boys were heavily involved in the Nuremberg trials as interrogators, interpreters, and translators. Even as interpreters, the Ritchie boys used their interrogation skills by suggesting to investigators what to ask and how to ask it. One Ritchie boy had an especially important assignment in the trials. An American-born Jew, Gustav Gilbert, was not only one of Camp Ritchie's trained interrogators, he also had a PhD in psychology. He served throughout the first Nuremberg trial as prison psychiatrist, with complete freedom of access to the prisoners. This put him in the unique position of observing and speaking with all of them. And as the only American officer on the prison staff who could speak German, Gilbert found the prisoners willing and eager to talk. Here we see him facing the prosecutor at the trial, attesting to the sanity of Hitler's deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess. Next slide. And finally, here are just a few of the notable people who went through training at Camp Ritchie. As you can see, they include musicians, writers, artists, inventors, architects, statesmen. And of course, every large organization has to have a bad apple. And you see one in the lower right-hand corner, Kurt Ponger, a convicted Soviet spy. This concludes my part of today's program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly, for that fascinating presentation. And thanks to all of you for all the interesting information that you've been putting into the chat. We're keeping track of it. We have a lot of people with direct connections to Ritchie Boys and then Ritchie Boys themselves. Our next guest is Dan Gross. Hello, Dan. He's our expert speaker. Dan is known as the archivist of the Ritchie Boys, and you heard Beverly pay tribute to Dan at the beginning of her talk. Dan has amassed more information on the Ritchie Boys than anybody else, including 20,000 personnel record cards, operations reports, special orders, reports on interrogations, and other sources on the Ritchie Boys. The link to his website is in the chat. Thank you for joining us, Dan.
I'm pleased to be here. I call myself a Ritchie Boy wannabe, so that if in a future life I can choose my occupation and vocation, I would be a Ritchie Boy. Well, I will accept one piece of nice words from Beverly, and that is that I got her hooked on writing the book about Camp Ritchie. That was the smartest thing I ever did. How did I get involved in it? Well, it turns out that in early January of 2005, there was an article in the Washington Post. And if we get the first slide, we'd show that article. The Post reported that there had been a meeting at Cascade, Maryland, which is where Camp Ritchie was. And it talked about the documentary called The Ritchie Boys, which had just been shown to a small group. I saw that. And in addition, the German producer of that film set up a website, and the website included a forum. And in the forum, it was expected that people could ask questions, just like people are asking questions today. I saw the many questions asking whether people knew my father, my grandfather, or me, in the case of living Ritchie Boys. And there were no answers. So I went to the National Archives and I said, is there any information there about Camp Ritchie and what went on during World War II? And the excellent archivist at the National Archives said yes, in various record groups. For example, in Record Group 165, the U.S. Army, there is a 4-volume history of the training at Camp Ritchie. And it includes many photographs. And it also is also included 59 boxes of personnel cards dealing with the Ritchie Boys. So I requested the boxes of personnel cards. And next slide. But before I get to the next slide, I collected this information for my own information, dealing with the statistics of World War II and showing the relationship of Camp Ritchie. So of 16.5 million Army, Navies, all kinds of servicemen, there were about 20,000 students, that is, people who were sent to Camp Ritchie to take a course. Most of them took the 8-week course, and 11,637 graduated. At that time, I estimated, when I prepared this, I estimated there were 400 surviving graduates. Today, I would estimate somewhere between 100 and 200. When I spoke to Ritchie Boys, I asked them if they remember seeing any wax, and most of them said no, there were no wax there. Were there any blacks? No, there were no blacks there. Well, it turns out that there were. So then I went to the records of the personnel cards. And if you go to the next slide now, I'll show you what these cards look like. There were 3 cards. I designated them A, B, and C. The A card was a little 3x5 card with typed information and some handwritten information. And it essentially followed a student through the period when he was at Camp Ritchie. Some students were there for 2 months. Some were there for 2 years. The B card had very little information, but it did have essentially a next of kin and also a assignment. So there was a book, as you can see on the lower right, volume 7, number 987. Next slide. The C card provided the most useful information because the student was asked to give information about parents, about himself, about his education, about his training, if he had any military training, and showed the record of his service after he came into the Army, where he got his basic training. If he became a member of ASTP, the Armed Services Training Program, and sent to college to study a language or a specialty. And then he indicated what languages he knew and to what extent. To this person, German, Italian, French, and Spanish. And his classification in the lower left, Max Horlich was a linguist in French as well as German. And then the date that he was alerted, and finally the date that he was released from Camp Ritchie. Next slide. So for a select Ritchie boy, I was able to prepare a timeline. And for Max Horlich, I find that he was born on this date in 1918. His education, his enlistment as a private into the Army, basic training, ASTP, when he was transferred to Ritchie, and he was alerted in September of 44, which was only 6 months after he arrived, although he did take a postgraduate class. And then his assignment was volume 7, number 987. I was able also to find out some information about transportation, although the transportation records were destroyed after the war. Max Horlich joined a special group called a Mobile Field Interrogation Unit. Number 1, there were 5. This was a group of about 65 enlisted men and officers who essentially traveled around in big trucks where they could do their interrogations in the field and avoid delay. It's interesting that last night at dinner, I was sitting with a couple and the subject of Camp Ritchie came up, and the lady said, my uncle was a Ritchie boy. It turned out he was in the same mobile field interrogation unit, as Max Horlick was. Then the next slide, with these timelines and with the information that I received from the A, B, and C cards, I prepared a database. And the database, which is more complete than this shows, not only the basic 8-week class, which is in column number 7, but I have also added those who took shorter classes. So it's a very comprehensive list of all approximately 20,000 students who came to Ritchie to take a class. Some didn't graduate. Even those who did not graduate, some of them went over and served as interrogators or as interpreters or as and in various other aspects. Next slide. Then at that point, and incidentally, this is from a presentation that I made at my retirement community when I arrived about 8 years ago. I listed the demographics. As Beverley Eddy has said, over 60% were born in the US. And next came Germany and Austria. And as far as religion goes, the greatest percent of people were Protestant of all kinds, and then Catholic and Jewish, and so on. Next slide. Now here I have also tried to summarize in a certain way information about Ritchie Boys. One Ritchie Boy was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He served in the Philippines. He was a member of the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, and I think he jumped on a mine in order to protect his fellow members. Ritchie Boys received Silver Star medals, mainly for bravery. They were dropped into France on D-Day, and they served. They died in World War II. They served with Army Airborne Divisions, with the Marine Corps. They served with the OSS. As far as I know, 3 of them became generals, and I list them down below. Grombacher, Ulanoff, and Walters. 2 of them became U.S. senators, Chaffee from Rhode Island and Church from Idaho, and a number became ambassadors. So they went on to outstanding careers. I don't know how many minutes I have left, but I just connected the dots with one Ritchie boy. His name was Scheiko Friedman, and it turns out that he was on one of the first flights on the night before D-Day, that is on June 5th of 1944, to jump in the plane which carried the commander of the 82nd Airborne, and which also carried a second Ritchie boy.
We have a lot of response to what you've been saying in the chat. I'm really fascinated by the relationships people have here who are on the program with the Ritchie Boys, and I know they have a lot of follow-up questions and comments they would like to make to you. So if you don't mind, let's move on to Bernie and Jill.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Our next 2 speakers are children of Ritchie Boys. Bernie Lubrin and his twin brother Robert are the sons of Walter Heinz Lubrin, who immigrated to the United States in September 1938 from Sebnitz, Germany, a small town on the Czech border. Bernie is president of the Friends of Camp Ritchie. And then we have Jill. Jill and her sister Kathy Gay are the daughters of Joseph Gay, who was born in Gleicher, a Jew born in Vienna, Austria. Joseph was in Colombia, the country of Colombia, at the start of the Anschluss and helped Austrian Jews escape to Colombia. He immigrated to the US, where he became a citizen and was drafted into the American Army during World War II. Let's start with Bernie. Bernie Lubrin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Todd. I want to start. This is a picture of my dad. He was a master sergeant in the Army, and I'm very proud of his service. But up until 2004, I knew virtually nothing about his experience as a Ritchie boy. I had never heard of the term Ritchie Boys. In 2004, I learned about the documentary film that Dan Gross referred to in the Washington Post. I traveled, because I live in the Washington area and it was convenient, I traveled up to Cascade and met with Guy Stern, one of the more prominent Ritchie boys, and that's the first time I saw Christian Bauer's movie, The Ritchie Boys. This is a blank slate in my life. My father, I knew he served in the Army. I knew he served in several camps over here in the United States. I knew he went to a place called Camp Ritchie. I didn't know what he did. I knew he went to Europe as an interrogator, and he told us very little about that experience. Little snippets was all we ever got. And part of it was my reluctance to even ask my dad about his service. He never spoke about the fate of his family, ever. And I felt it was too sensitive a topic. Thanks to Dan Gross, I really got involved in studying the history of my dad's service. Dan introduced me to the National Archives. I went there. I examined all the records. I saw the classes that my dad took. I even saw the grades that he received in the different classes. This was eye-opening. From that, I discovered a treasure of letters that my dad had written to my late mother. I never had a chance to open them or discuss them with my dad. From those letters, I learned the period that he was at Camp Ritchie. It turned out to be not 8 weeks, but about 16 weeks, because he had additional assignment to Fort Hunt, P.O. Box 1142. That's an entirely different story. But what I want to talk about is, once I learned about Camp Ritchie and realized that this story was incredible and had not been told, I started to do whatever I could to create a network. And it involved getting a group together with Dan Gross and a few others to do a national conference in 2012 of Ritchie Boys. We had 34 that attended. And then I came up with the idea of creating the Facebook page, Ritchie Boys of World War II. And I invite everyone to go there. It's a compendium of stories of Ritchie Boys, and I'm literally learning stories every day. I just posted about an Italian Ritchie boy who was born in the United States. Because of his language skills in Italian and French, he was sent to Camp Ritchie. There's so much information and not enough time to go over it, but please, I invite you, read the book from Beverley Eddy. Visit Dan Gross's website. From there, you'll want to know more. Come to our Facebook page. And I'll leave with just 2 important final notes. Number 1, last year, Senator Ben Cardin was instrumental, along with Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. The 2 senators were instrumental in passing a resolution to honor the Ritchie Boys. That was in August 9th of 2011. That was the first public recognition ever of what achievements the Ritchie Boys accomplished. Then in May 2nd of this year, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum awarded the Ritchie Boys their Elie Wiesel Award. And we're very excited that more things are going to happen very soon, especially in the U.S. Congress. There's an initiative underway to award a congressional gold medal. It's only been done a few times honoring World War II veterans. We don't have the exact date when it's going to be submitted, but we're going to publicize it to Dina and the group and on our Facebook page. And also for Ritchie Boy families, we hope to have some other good news related to the Holocaust Museum's award. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, Bernie, wonderful. And I know one of the exciting pieces of news is the forthcoming Ritchie Boys Museum that we're going to talk about after we hear from Jill. Jill, thank you for joining us. Let us know, tell us about your dad and what you know about his service.
Thank you so much for having me on this program. So I found out at age 70 that through my sister, Kathy Gay of Catherine Gay Communications, she contacted Dr. David Frey, the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, who confirmed that my father, Joseph Gay, born Joseph Gleicher, was a Ritchie boy. Like many of generations after, my father spoke little of his war experiences. And also, I've been seeing this in the chat, that many people didn't know the story of their fathers. But what I'll tell you is a little bit about what he told me. He found out he was drafted when he returned from his honeymoon, and my mother said to him, Wiesel, imagine you have a letter from the president of the United States. That was his draft letter. He tested highly on the IQ test. He lived in Austria until his 20s, and he spoke, of course, fluent German. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, so he could pass as an Aryan. He told me he was parachuted behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. He was allowed to choose if he went on missions, he told me. And he told me that he refused one mission and that afterwards was told that everyone on that mission had been killed. He experienced anti-Semitism in the US military during World War II by other soldiers. And he, since I know so little about his experiences as a Ritchie boy, I'll just give you a flavor of what he was like a little bit. His father had been an orphan. He grew up poor in Vienna. He had 3 sisters. He did his gymnasium thesis on Goethe. And so his mother, who had saved her pennies, gave him as a graduation present a train ticket to visit the birthplace of Goethe. He got on the train, met a beautiful Belgian woman, this was before my mom, and followed her to Belgium. There he learned Spanish, became a messenger for a company that did business with Colombia. He religiously read the telegrams that he was supposed to deliver. One was, quote, "I quit." So my father announced himself as the replacement and got to Colombia. He was in Colombia during Anschluss, and he saved everyone from his family and many others. This is the kind of man who became a Ritchie boy. He had many adventures. His idea of a road trip was taking the 5 of us, my mother and my sister and my brother and me, from Caracas, Venezuela to the border of Colombia in the 1960s. He rode horseback through the Amazon, and he died at home at age 86 with having had a long, happy marriage of more than 50 years and very beloved by me. And there's lots of comments and questions in the chat. So I'm turning it back over to our esteemed moderator.
I am esteemed. All right. That's good. Thank you so much, Jill. I appreciate that. And, we have so many comments in the chat. Not so many questions, but comments. We have fascinating people here, and I want to highlight a few of them. First, I want to go to Dan Gross and his son, Al Gross, who have worked for so many years at developing this Ritchie Boys archive and database. We have a lot of people in the chat here who are looking to track down family members, or maybe somebody who might know one of their loved ones who was a Ritchie boy. They could contact you, Dan and Al, to maybe get information that you might have.
I run the website at the moment. I'll probably be handing a lot of it over to Landon at the museum.
I would like to mention another name who would be in the best position to answer these questions, and that is of Steve Goodell, whose name should be familiar to many people because he served for many years. He worked for the Holocaust Museum. Steve has made it his avocation to follow the Ritchie Boys, and he has almost as much information about them as I have, since I pass it on to him. So Steve Goodell would be another excellent source. I myself am not going to the archives anymore. I notice a number of people would like to have timelines. There are ways of doing it, of course, but I can't do it.
So if somebody wants a timeline, or somebody wants to contact you, Dan, or Steve, or you, Al, is the best way to go to your website, theritchieboys.com?
Yes, that's the easiest thing. There's an email there. You can contact me. I'll send them the information that I have. And, there's maybe, I don't know, maybe 1,000 timelines, maybe a few, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred less than that. I'm not sure. But so, a lot of people are disappointed because we don't have the full timeline, but they can go to the archives and do the research themselves. Dad's pretty much explained it here, how he's done it. It takes some work, obviously.
And
we give them as much information as we can.
So you give them kind of what they need to maybe get started, and then whatever information you might have. So the people here in the chat, they should go to theritchieboys.com. That's theritchieboys.com to contact Al and Dan Gross and get some marching orders or get some information that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's easier than the chat, because then I can keep track of all the emails that come in.
Yeah.
We get a lot of them, especially when 60 Minutes runs the show.
Yeah, I can't imagine what your life was like after the 60 Minutes ran that show. And then the other piece of information that I think is great and connected to what you're doing, and Al, and you and your dad have done, is the Ritchie Museum at Camp Ritchie that is being created now. We have somebody here in the Zoom room, Landon Grove. Landon, if you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about the museum and the plans for its development.
So last year, a developer actually purchased Fort Ritchie. The Army closed it down in 1998 when it was bracked, and Ritchie really fell into a state of disrepair. So a lot of the buildings, the roofs were caving in. There was a lot of vandalism. And what we're doing now is we're rehabilitating all of those buildings and putting them into new use. So, different shops and different, vendors and so forth. Some of the non-commissioned officer housing is now filled up again. But the owner of the property dedicated 2 buildings to the museum, one being a research center for learning more about the Ritchie Boys, and the other as a museum space. So we have been awarded $400,000 from the state of Maryland for capital grants funds to rehabilitate both of those buildings. And we've also received about $50,000 in private donations as well. We do anticipate that the museum will be opened sometime this fall. We were hoping for this summer, but the funding from the state has taken quite a while to get to us. So it'll likely be the fall. And we've also had a number of Ritchie Boys families, sons, daughters, grandchildren, and so forth and so on, provide us with a lot of very rare and interesting items too. So that's all coming together very nicely. And, I have to really say thank you to folks like Dan and Al and Bernie and Bev, who've really laid the groundwork for this museum to exist. Without their dedication and research, none of it would be possible.
Oh, how wonderful. Now, is there somewhere where people can reach you or learn more about the museum in progress? Do you have a website up or a Facebook page?
Yes, we have a website. It's simply ritchiemuseum.org. And I can be reached at director@ritchiemuseum.org.
Director@ritchiemuseum.org, ritchiemuseum.org. That should be a busy place, I think, eventually for a lot of people here on this program and a lot of other people who have connections to Ritchie Boys. And we have some Ritchie Boys on the program with us right now, including, and I'm going to start with Frank Cohn, who I believe describes himself as a Ritchie Boy light. And this is fascinating because I had never heard of this, Frank, that there was Camp Ritchie where there was the training course to become a Ritchie Boy. But as with so many other things, sometimes the need was so great that they had to rush people through training. You were one of these Ritchie Boys that were given kind of a, I hate to put it like, cheap and dirty 2-week training and then thrown into it in France. Is that correct?
That's right. It was just a 2-week course, and it was given in Le Vessenay near Paris. So I came from Breslau, Germany, and nobody discovered I spoke German until I was overseas. And then I was dragged back into Le Vessenay, where they gave me the course, and I joined all the other Ritchie Boys in T-Force 12th Army Group. That's Task Force 12th Army Group. And we were committed of going into the big cities right after they were captured. And we had dossiers on building targets and personality targets. Building targets, anything that was of use to the force as we occupied Germany, and personality targets, all those who were going to be prosecuted in war crime trials. So it was a very interesting experience, believe me. I have stories of every city that we went, and we ended up meeting the Russians on the Elbe.
Oh. Have you written your story or recorded your story, and have you shared it with, or will you share it with the museum?
Well, the museum has a story, yes.
Excellent. Excellent. How long after the war did you finally come home? Were you there for any of the trials?
We didn't know what was going on most of the time. We found out much later that, for example, I was sergeant of the guard of war criminals in Oberursel near Frankfurt, which was an intelligence center after the war. But we had no idea who was in there. We always thought it was Goering. And of course, Goering wasn't there. He was in Berlin with the other prime ones. The ones we had were the concentration camp commanders and the deputies to the primary ones and primary Nazis. But it was such a close-knit situation that we had no idea who was inside.
Oh, Frank, I so look forward to learning more of your story. I'm going to be looking you up and looking your story up and hopefully contacting you to learn more. I believe we have Henry Block on, and I believe that Henry was a Ritchie Boy. He must be the oldest living Ritchie Boy at 108. I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a Ritchie Boy way back. And I'm now, I believe it or not, in that's hundreds of years old. And unfortunately, I became ill about 2 years ago. I lost my eyesight. And that's my biggest problem. Otherwise, I feel fine.
Oh, my.
What's the secret to longevity?
Heredity. I was born in Germany, went schools, and educated in college in Heidelberg for a short time until Hitler made it no longer possible for me to stay. And I was inducted with the rest of the German boys who were born in 1914 in the army. And I was in the German army for a short time. And I saw about her handwriting on the wall, and I made it my business to immigrate.
I want to mention that
Henry Bloch is a recipient of the French honor.
Sorry.
He said you're a recipient of the French Legion of Honor.
The French Legion of Honor.
War,
Legion of Honor.
yes, during the war, we were a team of 6 American film-born boys. We were assigned to regiments who needed interpreters, and I was assigned to a French armies. Under French combat team with General Leclerc, it was a French team, and we went with him for the entire campaign from Normandy to Strasbourg.
Henry, I regret that you're breaking up a bit on my side. I can only hear about every third word or so. So I just want to say that we're just honored to be in your virtual presence here today, just like we're honored to be with Frank Cohn. And I think we have one other Ritchie boy also with us, Herb Murez. Is Herb with us?
Okay, this is Herbert Murez.
Hey, Herbert Murez, thank you for joining us. How wonderful. How old are you, Herb?
99.
99, and you were a Ritchie boy.
Yep.
Did you get drafted or did you volunteer?
Well, I was drafted because I had the classification of an enemy alien because it was listed as German rather than Austrian. And therefore, I had to go through the draft board.
And at one point during your basic training, did they put you send you to Camp Ritchie?
Well, I was in basic training in Camp Crowder in Maryland, Camp Crowder in Missouri, excuse me. And they just pulled me right out of basic training and, hey, you've been transferred to Camp Ritchie.
And you, of course, had no idea what that meant.
Well, I knew it was a place that had something to do with intelligence. But the first dictate of intelligence is whatever information is possessed is limited to those who have a need for it.
You know, Herbert, I'm smiling because the Army has a reputation for, taking mechanics and making them bakers, I mean, it's rare that in basic training do they spot talent and then get the talent to where it needs to be. So I'm so grateful that the Army had that foresight. Did they end up sending you overseas or did you stay on the home front to do your work?
No, they sent me over.
And what did you do?
Well, by the time I got over, that was already, the invasion was an accomplished thing, and the armies were moving through France and into Germany. And in Camp Ritchie, I had been put into a group, a rather small group of document analysts. They were concerned with extracting strategic information from captured German army documents and German government documents and even some private documents that was of possible interest to other army branches or to allies.
And go ahead.
I was trained in that, and actually I had some interesting documents go through my hands, which I translated and analyzed.
Can you give us an example of an interesting document you translated?
I'll give you an example that to me is a whole lesson in civics. I believe it was 1935, that Hitler determined to reoccupy the Rhineland. And secretly, places were prepared where in the Rhineland where the troops could be stationed. And one fine day, without any advance warnings, the German troops rolled into the Rhineland with German army trucks and other vehicles and approached these prepared places. The French were very upset about this, sufficiently to be prepared to mobilize. But they wanted the English to go along. And England says, no, the war is over. We have our own problems. We have our unemployment problem and blah, blah, blah. And the French wouldn't go alone. And so Hitler got away with it. I read the military order, which Hitler signed himself. It had Hitler's personal signature, handwritten signature on it. And it said pretty much exactly as I am about to tell you. In case of any actions with French military forces, you are not to engage them, but you are turn right back around and go back whence you came. And later on during the Nuremberg trials, General Keitel testified that if there had been any resistance from France, they could have cut the Germans to pieces, and the Germans would not have put out any opposition, but gone right back to their garrisons on the east side of the Rhine. So the lesson of history that this has given me is that there has to be a will to resist evil.
There has to be a will to resist evil.
Yeah, there has to be that. Without that, all is lost. And if you delay, if as the price goes up, the longer you delay.
What wisdom you've just shared with us, Herbert. I mean, Herbert Murez and Frank Cohn and Henry Block. These are three people who are not only on the front lines of history, but who are heroes for helping to save the world from a great evil. And that lesson that you just taught us is something that I'll certainly remember and pass on. I do want to encourage people, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't pitch the Veterans Breakfast Club. I'm a historian, and we have these online programs and in-person programs where veterans like Herbert and Frank and Henry can come and share their stories. I would love to be in contact with Herbert, Frank, and Henry. I'd love the folks at the Veterans Breakfast Club to hear from you and hear your stories. I'd love to be able to interview over Zoom. Please do get in contact with me if the families of those veterans would like to do so. You can email me at Todd, T-O-D-D, at veteransbreakfastclub.com. That's Todd, T-O-D-D, at veteransbreakfastclub.com. I'm going to throw it back to you, Susan. Thank you so much, Susan, for allowing me to be a part of this program.
My pleasure.
Wow. I'm sure everyone is as blown away as I am from both the researched information and the unexpected living history we have heard by Herbert, Frank, and Henry, as well as so many of the write-ins in the chat. We appreciate all. It has enhanced this program immensely. What an honor it's been to hear from everybody, and we are so appreciative of everyone who shared their extensive knowledge and experiences with us. We've received an education from so many different angles on the life of a Ritchie boy, both before, during, and after their wartime exploits. Thank you so much, Beverly, Dan, Todd, Bernie, and Jill, Henry, Frank, and Herbert as well, and all who have written in, for opening our hearts and minds for this most memorable and informative program. A special shout out to Ephraim Katzir for his technical skills, without which we could not present all the programs we do throughout the year. Just so you know, everyone who registered for the program will receive a link in the recording on our YouTube channel within a few days, and that recording will have closed captions. So those of you who were having difficulty hearing, please know the closed captions will be in that recording. You'll also receive a short survey by email. It was also posted several times in the chat, and we'd be most appreciative if you would complete it to aid us in developing future programs. If you're a current member, thank you. If you'd like to become a member, please join. If you'd want to just make a one-time donation for this free program, we'll gladly accept that as well. You can visit our website, genafterdc.com, to learn more. Hopefully someone, maybe Dina, can post that in the chat. Our next program to entice you will be have anti-Semitism as its focus, and it'll be combined with our annual meeting on November 6th. And we hope to see you then. On behalf of the entire program committee and the Generations After, thank you so much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.